Welcome everyone to the third workshop in the post-award negotiation process for the Illinois Power Agency. I am Chandrika Mittal. I'm the Director of Renewable Energy Financing here at the IPA. We have typically someone from NERA, who is our procurement administrator, present. I believe there's Ben. Ben, if you just want to unmute and quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Benjamin Chi here with New Economic Consulting. I'm also joined with other people from NERA, Katie Olandi, as well as Jane Kim, who represent the NERA team on this call. Nice to meet everybody here. And looking forward to a very healthy and good discussion on this workshop. Back to you, Candy.
Thanks, Ben and NERA team. So, like I said, this is a third workshop, but if this is your first workshop, if you haven't attended the first two, I will quickly cover who everyone is, why we're here, what we're trying to do here, how this process will work over the next 2 hours or so. And then we'll get into some follow-up items from the last workshop that we couldn't get to as we ran out of time. And then we'll talk about our main topic for today is comparing other states' mechanisms for how they go about their REC procurements and lessons we can learn from some of the recent challenges they've faced in this process, which are similar to what Illinois is facing, which is why we're here. So like I said, I'm Chandrika. I'm also joined by Anthony Starr from the IPA. I just wanted to give him a minute to join. I think he's here. He's the Chief of Planning and Procurement Bureau here at the IPA, and he will be touching on the RPS budget topic. Anthony, if you want to quickly introduce yourself, we can go ahead and do that.
Sure. Good morning.
Great. I do want to go really quickly into who else we have on the call just to understand our stakeholders that are present. So if everyone can just maybe introduce the company you're representing or the organization you're representing. If you hear someone from your organization mention your organization's name, that's probably where we'll call it. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll have the time to get to know each one of you individually, but I just want to understand what are the organizations we have present on the call today. You do have the ability to unmute yourself during
Cameron,
this.
Illinois is present.
Thanks.
ComEd is as well.
Hi, Chris Kozlowski from Earthrise Energy.
Ryan Scott, Rev Renewables.
Eric Ayub, CDF Renewables.
Isaac Meyer, EDP Renewables.
This is Elizabeth Wheeler with Clean Grid Alliance.
Sarah
Thank you,
Waldman, Apex Clean Energy.
Couple of folks on from NYSERDA, New York's REC market administrator.
Denton Apple with Mercuria Energy.
Paul Jimenez with Emeren.
Hi there, a few folks from NextEra Energy on.
I do want to say thanks someone from the ICC should be on this call as well, which was part of the feedback we heard that stakeholders wanted that. So I want to say maybe Jackson, are you still on today? Maybe not yet, but I know that he was registered, so hopefully he joins them. Anyone else that didn't hear their organization's name called out and they're here today?
Twiggy Mendenhall with Clean Capital.
Hi, Alejandro Isela on behalf of Invenergy.
Anyone else we might be missing? Okay. Looks like we have a solid group of, I believe, folks who have participated in our procurements and folks who have not. So hopefully we can have a good discussion today. So really quickly, what is the index rec procurement? If you've not participated in the Illinois index rec procurement yet, the ability to meet RPS goals for our utilities. This is how the utilities are able to, I guess, meet their RPS targets. The Illinois Power Agency implements this process, and the contract is signed between the developer and the utility. So IPA is not a party to this contract, but we, along with NERA Economic Consulting, who's our procurement administrator, help implement this process. As part of this process, what we've learned based on feedback from various stakeholders is usually this is a process that people partake in for their utility scale solar, wind, and now certain hydro projects. In the post-COVID environment, or I guess COVID and post-COVID environment, we were hearing a lot of feedback on typically this index rec contract is one of the first steps in the development process for these utility scale renewable projects. And the time frame between this contract gets signed and by the time the project is ready for energization, it can be several years. And we learned that sometimes the economics that people assume when they're bidding into this process have significantly changed by the time the project is ready for energization. At that point, currently in the process, the only option that a developer has is to terminate the contract or build an uneconomic project. We received, like I said, feedback from stakeholders saying that they would like to explore a process where they could renegotiate closer to when the project is ready for construction in such scenarios when environment which is outside of their control has significantly changed. We explored this process through our long-term plan where we mentioned that we will be conducting these workshops. Our long-term renewable energy procurement plan is how we address a lot of these comments and typically have in the past. It's a plan that we work on every 2 years. So our most recent plan was published in 2024. Our next plan will be published in 2026, and this plan is the guiding framework that we use to conduct these procurements for those periods. So for example, in the 2024 plan is how we are conducting these procurements in 2024. 2025, and then in 2026 plan is how those procurements will be guided. I want to address why are we holding these workshops? Because we want to be proactive. We want to see our state meeting its RPS goals. And if there are factors that are a significant challenge for folks to develop renewable projects in this state, then we want to hear what those challenges are and how we can help navigate those challenges. That is the reason why the IPA is holding these workshops, as we want to explore this conversation deeper and understand where the challenges lie and what we can do in the rules and guidelines that guide us within that. Information that's shared during this workshop is how we will understand the challenges that folks like yourself are facing in this environment, and that is how we'll be hopefully able to develop a compliance filing that we will be filing with the ICC that we're required to file by February 2025 if we want to see a post-award negotiation process or a change in the index rec procurement process go through. I do want people to understand that we realize that a lot of the information that we're seeking as part of this process is something that can be commercially sensitive to your organizations. But if you think it's something we should understand or know, you always have the option to submit confidential feedback to us that we will not be posting as comments on our website. We typically redact the confidential portion if there is something called out as confidential. During this workshop, like our first two, we want this to be conversational. We want to understand where you're coming from and the challenges you're facing. and how we can address and navigate those. So, like I said, everyone has their mics or the ability to unmute your mic just the way you did to introduce yourself. So I would like this to be as conversational as possible. We will, unlike the first two workshops, have some materials that we will share with you in a presentation format. Primarily two things. One we will be talking about, which was a follow-up from the last workshop, is the RPS budget. This is how the funding for meeting our RPS goals comes from. We understand that there have been a lot of concerns around our budget, and in our long-term plan, we had, in our most recent 2024 long-term plan, we had stated that we will be sharing updates as to when the procurements are happening, how this budget is evolving. So as part of this workshop, we do want to touch on that, as that was feedback received from most of you. That is a topic that you would like to discuss and possibly understand deeper on how it works. Anthony Starr, who introduced himself earlier, who we saw, will be the one running through the RPS budget conversation and presenting what the budget looks like today, what are the different factors that go into the structuring and the collection and the expenses of this budget. And we will see some updates from, like I said, the 2024 long-term plan. Our hope is to share more updates, ideally quarterly, with you on how the budget is progressing through the year as we conduct more procurements. Typically, if you don't already know, our index drug procurements are conducted twice a year. So we have a spring-summer procurement and then usually a fall procurement. We completed our summer procurement early and we're entered into the fall procurement session. Our current procurement structure, I do want to call out, while it's parallelly ongoing, I don't want anyone to think that the conversation we're having in this workshop is by any means applicable into how the procurement is set up today. This is a way for us to explore how we can change the procurement structure to better meet your needs and your challenges. But until we have a full understanding and the conversation is wrapped up, and until we have submitted in our compliance filing with the ICC, and until it is approved, there will be no changes to how the index drug procurements are conducted right now. I do want to pause really quickly before we jump into our follow-up discussion topic from last time, which was around the RPS budget. If anyone has any questions or anything they feel we should be addressing that we haven't addressed right now about what's about to happen in the next hour to two, I want to pause and just give you a second to mention that if there is anything. If not, we will probably switch over to the presentation. Like I mentioned really quickly earlier, we have a presentation prepared to talk about the RPS budget. And then when we get into the topic for today's workshop, where we will compare other states, primarily northeastern states that have seen similar challenges to what we're seeing in Illinois, we will compare how those states have addressed those challenges, any reforms that they've implemented, and that will be a presentation as well in case there are folks on the call here that are not familiar with what happened, maybe more on the offshore side in the northeastern states. We will highlight that for you. The IPA and NERA team has spoken to state officials from these northeastern states, primarily New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, to better understand the challenges they faced, which were similar to the challenges we're facing, not exactly the same, but similar, and trying to understand how they navigated those challenges and what were the reforms they introduced in their processes to address these challenges. So those are the states we will be talking about later. If anyone thinks that there are other states that we should have looked at, that we didn't look at, we are more than open to that feedback. So when we get into that portion, please feel free to highlight anything that we may not have covered in those states. I want to say maybe Bram mentioned from New York or NYSERDA that there are some folks on the call from New York in case there are any questions that come up that we haven't been able to address in our research. Hopefully we can pull on his team to answer those, but I don't think we have representatives from other states on this call today, but if there is any feedback, we're happy to take it back and look into it for you. Before we get into the key topic, like I said, let's jump into the RPS budget. So Tori, if you don't mind pulling up the presentation, please. And Anthony, I'll let you take over for the RPS portion.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we just need to advance a slide or two. One more. Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to spend a few minutes doing is sort of going through what the RPS budget in Illinois is, sort of a little bit of the history of it, how it's structured, some of the issues and challenges we have around setting the budget, and then a little bit of discussion around possible things and levers we have for adjusting assumptions going forward. I suspect for some of you on the call, you'll see a lot of information that you've seen before, but we wanted to just make sure to have a basic baseline of understanding of how the budget system in Illinois works for supporting renewables, and use that as one of those sort of touch points for the subsequent conversations. So in thinking about it, there really are three major phases of the RPS budget. The RPS in Illinois was initially established in 2007, so it was a period through 2016 where we had an initial structure. That was revised, the Future Energy Jobs Act which passed late 2016, took effect in 2017. That had its set of issues, which were then addressed through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act of 2021, which is the applicable law right now. And I suspect we will see in the future subsequent legislation making further changes. So when the RPS was first established in 2007, it only applied to default service customers. Those are the residential and small commercial customers in Illinois who didn't switch to other suppliers. And it was set with a rate cap of a little bit over 2% of what the rates were in May 2007 for customers. Alternative suppliers who serve the larger customers and the residential and small commercial customers who chose to switch to other suppliers, they started having an RPS obligation in 2009, or legislation was enacted in 2009 for that. And that was done through a combination of the alternative suppliers procuring RECs and then also making payments into a state fund called the Renewable Energy Resources Fund. This model had a variety of challenges to it. First and foremost, the rise of municipal aggregation meant that the number of default service customers shrank significantly, and therefore there was less funding available, and that could change year to year. So it created this great budget uncertainty. There was also a problem that the Renewable Energy Resources Fund, this was a period of time when the finances of the state of Illinois are not as strong as they are today, and that some of that money was diverted to other uses by the state during some of our more difficult financial times. So this created a real budget certainty because year to year there was not any certainty of how much money would be available to support renewable efforts. And as a result, the IPA in our procurement plans basically was only able to propose annual procurements of renewable energy credits from spot markets. The one exception was a procurement we did in 2010 for some long-term power purchase agreements. So the initial model of the RPS was very convoluted because there were different buckets of money that could be used for renewables, and they would change year to year. So there was no way to do proper planning. Next slide. So one of the many things the Future Energy Jobs Act did was change that, where first there was a focus, change the focus of the RPS to spurring development of new projects, and where renewable energy credits would be the tool we would use to support those projects. This was also when we were given the legislative authority to have specific procurements for new utility scale wind, solar, brownfield projects, as well as the creation of our incentive programs, Illinois Shines and Illinois Solar for All, for distributed generation and community solar. The Future Energy Jobs Act also consolidated funding. It phased out over a period of a couple of years the alternative suppliers having their own requirements, and created a consolidated budget of about $230 million a year collected from customers. Now, one thing the Future Energy Jobs Act did not do is it didn't create specific funding buckets. There was a amount of money that was collected from ratepayers, but then how that money was budgeted for various types of procurements, whether it was utility scale projects, which at the time were supported through fixed direct price contracts, or for renewable energy credits from smaller scale projects, that was set out in a long-term plan, but there was not, again, there was not specific buckets or line items for any given type of project we would have to look at and forecast things. A challenge we then faced was the way the Future Energy Jobs Act structured the budget was that for the first 4 years, money collected in a given year, if it wasn't spent, could be rolled over to the next year. But after 4 years, any unspent money would be refunded back to customers, and then there'd be annual collections and expenditures. This didn't work in large part because of COVID, where a large amount of money was allocated to community solar projects in 2019, which were expected to be completed by 2021 and starting to receive payments for their renewable energy credit. That obviously did not happen because development came to a halt in 2020. And so we were faced in the fall of 2021 with a scenario where there was money that under the law was due to be refunded back to customers, even though there were large contractual obligations looming in the future, which was sort of a artifact of how the law was written, but not a sort of nonsensical way to approach these things. Next slide. The Climate and Equitable Jobs Act did a number of things, again, to update and refine the RPS in Illinois. Key among those was, first, it increased the amount of funding that was available by increasing the rate cap and also resetting it to a different sort of test year for what that amount was based upon. This increased the amount of money being collected from customers to up to about $580 million a year. It also replaced that model I described with a new model of a 5-year first in, first out accounting system, where basically money was collected from ratepayers and was available for use for 5 years, and then any money from year 1 in year 6 that was unspent would be refunded to customers. However, any refunds would be reduced if there were existing contractual obligations yet to be paid. This in reality means that the money will be collected, and as long as there's expenditures going on, all is available to be spent. Only if things were to really, really come to a halt would you ever see a scenario where refunds to ratepayers would be made. We also switched to the competitive procurement model of indexed RECs, which I believe everyone on this workshop is likely familiar with, where the REC price is not set like it was during the procurements we did after the Future Energy Jobs Act passed. Instead, the REC price was based on the difference between the strike price that the winning bidder received and whatever the wholesale market price of electricity in a given month is. So this created revenue certainty for projects that the combination of the REC price and energy price would add up to their strike price, but it created uncertainty for us in terms of budgeting, because at any given moment in time, we can look at forecasts of future energy prices, but as I'll get to in a few slides, those are constantly changing. Next slide. If you want to delve into all of the details of this, Chapter 3 of our long-term plan has a detailed discussion of the RPS budget, and then we have a spreadsheet available as Appendix B that lets you really look at all the numbers, look at the formulas, you can make changes if you like, all those sorts of fun things. Those are available on our website, and they reflect the long-term plan that was published in April of this year. We're currently working on an update to the RPS budget, hoping to release it in mid-October, and then quarterly updates coming after that. I'm going to show some preliminary data on some of the following slides of what you'll see in that update. The key changes from what we released in April are, first, we've updated the volumes of RECs under contract. There are various activities going on since the spring, such as a procurement we held for utility scale RECs over the summer. Those numbers are now in the budget. Now, this doesn't change things much because we already had forecasts of those, and now they're moving basically from the projected or forecast REC quantities into our RECs under contract. A very significant change is the change in the forward price curve. This is what we use to estimate future costs of indexed RECs, and I'll be talking about this quite a bit shortly. We also are going to do a better job, and this is something that I'm looking back at the long-term plan, previous things we've done in the budget, we've not done a good enough job explaining, is better showing what exists in terms of obligations from contracts that already exist or what's going to be planned from the current plan, and what would have to be approved through future plans. I think, as you'll see in a couple of slides, making that distinction has a very significant impact on sort of understanding where the obligations and uncertainties are in our RPS budget. Next slide. So it's a quick overview of where the RECs are coming from. It's a combination of, down at the bottom, you can see the RECs going back to 2010 that we procured. The ABP, those are the recs for small scale distributed generation and community solar. Orange are recs from the procurements we ran under the Future Energy Jobs Act. Those are 15-year contracts. So you see that they begin to, end in around 2020, 35. And you can see the impact of the procurements we've conducted to date for RECs and under the index REC procurement. But we also have a large shortfall in terms of if you stop today, what we've done does not obviously meet the RPS targets that the state has. Next slide. So what do we do to address that issue? So we have a set of activities that were approved in the 2024 plan. So we have an index REC procurement coming up later this year. We have 2 REC procurements planned for next year, and we have blocks capacity for the Illinois Shine program. So you add those in, those are the gray sort of part of this area graph. And then there'll be future plans. So, there's things like we'll have a plan that will be approved in February of 2026 that will cover activities in 2026 and 2027. Another plan would be approved in 2028, 2030, and so on. So there's a lot of things that are kind of anticipated we'll need to meet our RPS targets, but are still going to have to go through a future ICC approval of one of our long-term plans. So I want to sort of just differentiate between what's known today is what we've done. We have a set of things that we expect over the next 2 years, and then there's the further out things that we expect will happen in the future through long-term plans, but there's going to be a lot of discussion, debate, consideration before those future plans are approved. Next slide. So how do we develop our budget estimate? We start with the RECs that are under contract. These are obviously the things that are most knowable. So we look at the REC prices from procurements that have already taken place, where we know what the REC price is. We make assumptions for projects that are not yet energized of how long they will take between when their contract is approved and when they come under contract. For index REC procurement, we make assumption that projects will be energized 3 years after the contract. And we use the forward price curve where we use data from EOX and Argus to look at futures prices going out to 20 years. And we use those against the strike price to come up with an estimate of what we expect the expenditures for index REC will be. We also have a statutory set aside of $50 million for the Illinois Solar for All program to support income eligible solar. There's some money set aside every couple of years for job training, and then we also have an estimate of our ongoing administrative expenses. So those are the sort of the most known numbers. Although with index REC procurements, obviously, there still is an assumption at this time about the price that will change in the future based upon how forward market prices change. For the 2024 plan, we assume that we will successfully procure everything up to our targets for index REC projects, and that we'll fill all the blocks capacity for the Illinois Shines program. We've also have some assumptions about how the Illinois Shines program, which has REC prices that are administratively determined rather than set through competitive bidding, that those will decline 4% year to year. And then for future plans, we assume levels of activity similar to what we have in the 2024 plan, although in 2030, we begin scaling down some of those volumes a bit so that the overall number of RECs that would be procured meet the RPS target. So there's sort of a layer of sort of, from top to bottom here of things that are sort of more certain and increasingly less certain as we go along. Next slide. So some of the key unknowns for our budgeting model. The first is the forward price curve. One of our observations as we're getting ready, the update we'll be releasing in a few weeks, is that the forward price curve has been falling. It's fallen about $4 a megawatt hour on average over the next 20 years since we released the long-term plan in April. This has a huge impact because if you look at what's under contract, what we expect to do in the 2024 plan, and what we plan to do in the subsequent plan to carry on at our planned level of activity, we would have about 340 million RECs delivered through 2040. So a $4 a megawatt hour decrease in the forward price of electricity is basically adding another $1.2 billion of spending compared to what we had in the long-term plan. Now, obviously, if the forward price curve goes up again, that number will decrease. But at least at this point in time, our snapshot is that REC prices look quite different than we thought they would in April. We also have the unknown that projects may take longer to energize. because of any number of reasons why projects take a long time to develop. So our assumptions about when expenditures will start may be off. There could also be projects that get done faster than we expected, but probably by and large, we're more likely to see delays than projects getting done early. We don't know what the future REC prices are for the Illinois Shines program. There's a lot of things changing in the distributed generation market, shifts for residential customers on net metering values, a smart inverter rebate that's going to be updated at some point in the next year, ongoing trends with equipment costs. Overall, the assumption we use for modeling is probably ripe for revisiting, and that's something we'll be looking into over the next year. There's also a large customer self-direct program. This allows very large customers to self-procure RECs in exchange for receiving a reduction in their RPS charge. That program is slowly growing, and right now the methodology for setting their reduction is results in a fairly small reduction rate. So the impact on the RPS budget is not significant, but as the program grows, or if that methodology were to change in the future through statutory changes, the impact on the RPS budget from the self-direct program could change. We also don't know future load growth. This has certainly been the hot topic for the last 6 to 9 months, that load growth is maybe higher than people had forecast. That will increase RPS collections. That's good. On the other hand, our RPS targets will go up as well if we need to offset a larger portion of load. So certainly something that's very much in play is understanding what the future will look like and what forecasts we've made that need to be revisited. Next slide. So these are two different views of future expenditures. The graph on the right is similar to the one that is in the April 2024 plan that shows that if we continue on the path that we are right now with the level of activities in future plans at the level we had forecast of what we need to do to meet the RPS, we would end up hitting a $3 billion deficit in 2020 and 2039. And this is about $1 billion higher than we had when we published the long-term plan. And that is almost entirely due to the decrease in the forward price curve. Some of the other updates of volumes and a few small formula errors had small increases, small changes to this forecast. But the key thing is what the ongoing uncertainty about the forward price curve. But there's another way to look at that, and that's the graph in the lower left. This is what if we only looked at what is currently under contract today, and what if we only did the activities that have been authorized through the 2024 long-term plan. If you do that instead, and basically saying, let's take off the table anything that happened after the current plan is over, because that's subject to the next plan development process, then we have a much better view of the future. And in fact, the year-end balance, because in any given year, money is collected from ratepayers and then goes out to pay for contracts, never goes below $290 million. So in terms of what we know is authorized today, the outlook is much rosier than if you build in assumptions about future plans that have not been developed yet, let alone approved. So I think this is the difference and contrast between these two graphs, I think is really important and something that maybe has not been as clear in the past when we've done information about the RPS budget. So going forward, we plan to include both versions of these projections in our RPS budget updates, and we'll continue to update how we portray these numbers in our future plan. Next slide. So what are some of the options and issues around managing the RPS budget? In terms of the short term, we can continue to look at what our targets are for our competitive procurements we're going to be holding next year. Similarly, we'll be updating REC prices for the Illinois Shines program in the spring, and that's following methodology that was approved in our current plan, but we'll be updating cost input. So those are two things that will have an impact on the budget based upon the plan as we know it today. Then you go into the 2026 long-term plan. There's going to be stakeholder feedback we'll be soliciting starting next spring and into the summer, releasing that plan next summer for comment. So there's also, we can consider a variety of changes to competitive procurements, this workshop obviously being front and center in how we're looking at what sort of things we could do to consider changes in the model for the future. There's also adjustments to the Illinois Shines program in terms of the size of the program, how we approach direct pricing that we can look at. So much bigger levers are going to be available in the long-term plan. And then finally, there's legislative changes. The IPA is not endorsing or suggesting any of these changes at the time, but based upon conversations that we understand are happening amongst stakeholders, around possible legislative solutions. These are just a few that I would flag for consideration. One is ability to adjust RPS collections to ensure there's sufficient annual funding. Some of the challenges we have, as I was saying, from the changes in the forward price curve, are that we have this year-to-year uncertainty that as electricity prices change, the amount we'd have to pay for index rec will change. So the ability to have some sort of adjustment mechanism to ensure that year-to-year there's sufficient funding would be useful. Right now, the rate at which customers are charged for the RPS is fixed at a number based upon 2009 rates. It does not adjust for inflation. The buying power of the RPS will decline over time. That could be recalibrated as well. I mentioned that there are not separate funding sources for utility scale and smaller scale renewables projects. Separate funding streams to create more certainty could be something that's under consideration. We've raised some hearings the idea of thinking about different incentive mechanisms for distributed generation and community solar. Residential customers are finding 15-year rep delivery contracts are very confusing. This may not be the best way to support distributed generation. So we're definitely interested in changes that could come in the future that might change the incentive mechanism and therefore the funding stream for support of those sorts of projects. Additional changes to utility scale project procurement, the items we're discussing in these workshops, some can be addressed through our plan, but some will ultimately lead to things that would need consideration through legislation. The large customer self-direct program is something that I know there's been a real interest in and some desires to recalibrate how that program works to bring additional value to large customers, but we want to make sure that that's done in the context of ensuring sufficient RPS funding for projects that are participating in the Illinois RPS. And I'm sure there are many other ideas above and beyond what I've suggested that could be considered as well. So I think with that, that is sort of my quick overview of the RPS budget. Do we have time for a few questions, Chandrika, or do you want to move on to the next section?
No, I think this is probably a good time, Anthony, to take a break.
Great.
It's fresh to see what questions people might have. I know in the past, there were a lot of concerns about budget or potential projected budget shortfalls. So this would be a good time when we just talked about kind of how the budget works, what goes into under contract budget items versus projected budget items. I feel like that was a very important, and thank you for explaining that so well, Anthony. So if there are any questions about the budget, how it works, or what possibly we could be doing or what we're not looking at, if there's any feedback or questions about what Anthony just shared, this would be a great time to bring those forward.
Can we go back to the slide with the two different future outcomes on funding surplus versus shortfall? And this is really helpful. Just to make sure we're listening well, it sounds like the chart on the left assumes a forecast on energy price curves, given indexed contract prices, and assumes a volume of PPAs or index rec contracts through the current cycle that's covered by the 2024 long-term plan, which means that you get full subscriptions and hit your volume targets for fall of this year and 2 more procurements next year. And then you pause and there's no more new deals after 2025. Is that right?
That's correct. So yes, if we do not hit our procurement volumes and expenditures would be lower. If this is also based upon an update of the forward price curve. And so that's, so if electricity prices continue to fall, then that would also impact this as well. On the other hand, if electricity prices were to rise, the estimated expenditures would then go down. But at any given point in time, we have to take a snapshot of what the futures markets are. That's, the futures markets are the best tool we have to predict future electricity prices. If you have, we use EOX and Argus that I mentioned. Obviously, there's other data sources out there as well. And, so different people may have different models of what future electricity prices look like.
Understood. And that's great clarity. And then to the chart on the right, which obviously shows a potential, significant shortfall. it sounds like that assumes that you continue to procure into the future to continue to hit at full volume
Yeah.
what the RPS goals are over the longer term. And just given that that's many more, many more megawatt hours, that puts more strain on the budget. And given the way the legislation, the state policy is set up now, and again, given the forward curve assumptions, could be right, could be wrong, that if you continue long term to hit your goals, then you dive into potentially 3 billion negative.
Correct. Although there's many layers of uncertainty, we may, as we continue to refine the Illinois Shines program, if REC prices there were to go down, those prices the payment contracts pay out much faster than the 20-year index REC contracts. So that could have a significant change in the expenditures as well. But based upon what we know today and what we forecast for the future, this is what a full successful participation would look like, and what would require if future energy prices were not to change, which we know obviously is not the case.
Right, understood. No, this is super helpful, and it sounds like, and I'm sorry if some of these are newcomer questions to the mechanism, but it sounds like the broad directional opportunity to address potential budget shortfalls is either at a state policy level to change the funding mechanism, which sounds like it would require higher costs for ratepayers, or to end up working with some of these different levers within the program. Although the scope of these levers to make changes, are probably not dramatic for any given lever. Everything would have to go the right way, and energy forward curves would have to, in reality, rise to allow you to come anywhere close to hitting your targets if you're not going to impose higher costs at a policy level on ratepayers. Is that a fair takeaway?
Generally, although I would add the caveat that, one opportunity, especially through statutory change and maybe to a lesser extent through changing our plans, is there may be ways of figuring out how to lower the cost. So for example, when we look at the REC prices for the Illinois Shines program, maybe we'll look at, what's the appropriate level of support for those sorts of projects and determine a lower REC price makes sense. So that could be a scenario. De-risking the index REC procurement should, in theory, lead to lower bid prices. That would also reduce costs. And I know, again, is one of the purposes of this workshop. But those are all very speculative ideas. I think the challenge we face is that there's the things we can control, there's the things we can't control, and the things we can't control dominate the different outlooks we have here.
Understood. That's awesome clarity. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Don. And I just want to highlight two things that, Don, you touched on, Anthony, you mentioned. Number one, the future projections, the graph on the right, assumes not only we keep procuring every 2 years, which is how we do the procurements, and they keep getting approved, right? So at some point, if let's say we are forecasting budget shortfall, the only way to enter into a shortfall is for us internally. And when we publish this, everyone can see that we're hitting a shortfall. And then the idea is we truly hit a shortfall if everyone, including IPA, ICC, says, yes, let's keep procuring at this rate, at this price, and then keep hitting that shortfall, which seems very unrealistic, probably not going to happen. So that's the point I want to highlight, that we do this every 2 years. And now we're going to be updating these RPS budget figures quarterly, which means that we're looking at it very regularly to show what's truly under contract and what the budget looks like versus what we're projecting and wanting to do and what the budget would look like, keeping all of these factors under consideration, the forward price curves, the different ways that we're structuring our different programs, and the fact that we're continuing to procure at the same level, given all these other factors. What we're looking at today is what it looks like. So I just want to highlight that for it to reach a shortfall level, that means collectively a lot of people are potentially ignoring in that particular long-term plan that there is a shortfall that everyone can strikingly see, and we're still going ahead and conducting procurements to truly reach our shortfall, which again, probably not going to happen. Seems very unrealistic.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points that we may want to make with the graph on the left, is that there's still time to address these issues before that scenario plays out. Because if you look at the activities we have planned through next year, we look in much better shape. Then we have some hard choices coming down. down the road.
Yeah, and totally understand. Don't mean to imply this is an uncontrolled freight train by any means. It's just helpful to see the different directional pathways that things could go to highlight what the variables are. So appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing I want to highlight is if you want to really dig into this in the Appendix B to our long-term plan, which is a spreadsheet available on our website, you can go into that. There's a line on one of the tabs that's a forward price curve. You could put in a different forward price curve and then go to a tab that shows the expenditures and see the impact. So if, I think that's a really interesting way of sort of understanding the sensitivities, and we'll be publishing an updated version of that spreadsheet as well when we release some updates to this later in October.
Any other questions about the budget, the mechanism?
Hey, this is Chris Kozlowski from Earthrise. Just curious, I believe you all, the IPA, I should say, in the 2024 long-term plan, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the IPA is committed to sort of managing to 95% of the projected RPS budget in future procurements. My question is there any plan to reduce that target percentage of budget to something less than 95%? And or do you know what the level of forward prices would need to be reduced by if you did manage to 95% of the plan to trigger a shortfall?
So the 95% is the current long-term plan. So that's sort of the policy we have in place through until the next long-term plan is approved. And that's what, one of the things that I hope the graph on the left illustrate is that right now what we're looking at is we're far away from hitting that threshold. If we're collecting about $580 million a year and we don't expect our year-end balance to fall below $290 million, we're a long way away from having 95% of the funds committed. In terms of your question of how far would electricity prices have to fall, I don't know that off the top of my head. We'd have to go into the spreadsheet and put in numbers until we hit that scenario.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, understood that you're not at the 95% threshold yet, but the plan would be to keep procuring until you get there, right?
Right, because right now, based upon current expected volumes, based on current forward electricity prices, we're not going to get close to 95% because we're never falling below, more than half a year of collection.
Yeah,
but
I
if we
guess
do
what I'm
a
trying
process
to,
in 2026, the number might look a lot tighter. But in terms of whether we would, at the current path, would we hit it in which year we'd hit it, we'd have to do some math to figure that out.
no, I guess what I'm just trying to understand is to make sure that the truth is somewhere between the two graphs on the screen, right? Because while it's comforting to sort of look at the graph on the lower left and say, we still have room, the plan for the IPA is to keep procuring over and above that in the future plans.
Right, but to the point Chandrika is making, the next plan would have to be approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission. I can't speak for them, but I would imagine they would take into consideration our budget estimate contained in that plan before approving future procurement, let alone the results of the procurements themselves.
And just to add, Anthony, that also will be only for the 2 years following that plan. So we're cumulatively talking about potentially 3 years into the future. And if we don't look at what we'll be procuring through the 2026 plan, so just to address the first part of your question, if you're just looking at what we're procuring through the 2024 plan, given where the price curves are today, we are not even hitting close to reaching that 95% number. And if we were to continue procuring at the same level through the 2026 plan that gets approved, at which point we will look at the refreshed forward price numbers at that point. I think currently the way we're projecting, even through that plan, we're not seeing anything concerning over to after the 2026 plan, right, Anthony? If we were to look at the
I would have to double
Right.
check like which plan would create the pinch point.
Mhm.
But it also, I mean, one of the reasons I sort of wanted to start with talking about the history of how the RPS has evolved is, well, you know, we can't, you know, also can't speak for the Illinois General Assembly. We do have a history in Illinois of updating the RPS every few years as we learn, you know, what the drivers and challenges of it are. So I know there's a lot of interest right now in a variety of different legislative topics that hopefully will lead to some, you know, structural changes to how the Illinois approaches our clean energy goals. And part of our goal of getting this information out is to help inform those discussions. So can't guarantee that in the next year legislation will pass that will impact this, but certainly our hope is that this will be something that will be taken under consideration during the legislative discussion.
Can I just ask if we end up with a situation where you dip a bit negative? What happens under the index rec contracts? Do payments to the projects just get delayed for a few months until further ratepayer funds come in, and then payments resume and everybody's just a couple months behind, or what happens?
We have a variety of different contracts, and I don't want to speak generically to all of them because I think different contracts have slightly different provisions in them on that. It might be best for us to follow up on that. Because I don't want to say something incorrect.
Understood.
Any other questions on the RPS budget topic before we move over?
I do have a question. This is Tiffany. I'm wondering, nice to see you, Anthony. I'm wondering if there is, if there's a sense, just from a macro level, that the participation that the IPA anticipates receiving from developers for these procurements, is that in alignment with what you would expect to see? Or is just sort of concerns about the RPS being able to satisfy the contracts impacting the interest in your solicitation?
One challenge of being on our side is we don't know why bidders bid what they bid or don't bid what they bid. We only see certain inputs. So that sometimes makes it a little hard to answer a question like that. In terms of you know, our recent procurements, we've been hitting our solar target. So that sector feels alive and well. It's no secret where we are not hitting, we haven't hit our wind targets in several procurements, had slightly better luck in our spring procurement than the one previous to that. But there's so many factors impacting development. To what extent is this budget concern the issue? Is it the interconnection delays? Are there other financing concerns? It's hard for us to always sort of know for sure which of those factors is the tipping point, or you know how they fully add up. But the extent to which we can find ways to address and remove problems, that's the goal of these workshops, as well as our ongoing discussions about budgeting reform.
Thank you.
Last chance for questions on the RPS budget, and we soon move over to our topic for the third workshop. Okay. Hearing none, thank you so much, Anthony, for your time and for putting together the materials for this presentation. I hope this was really helpful, and like Anthony mentioned, we will be putting out a memo in mid-October touching on kind of the snapshot you saw today in terms of what's happening with the RPS budget, what are we projecting, and where the forward price curves are and where we stand from a contractual standpoint. So thank you so much, Anthony. And we will jump into our topic for today's workshop, where we're talking about mechanisms that other states are using for their REC contracts. I will highlight a couple things before we jump into it. The reason we call our procurements index REC is because they're indexed to the wholesale price of power. You will see some terminology during the rest of our workshop where we talk about indexing. So we will be particular to talk about whether it's inflation indexing or the indexing that we refer to in our procurements is more on the wholesale price of power. The way our RECs are structured, it's not a fixed price REC, it's indexed to the price of wholesale power. So I do want to clarify that before we get deep into this and start confusing any of these terminologies, because they are used in different senses for different states. Another terminology point that I want to highlight is a lot of these other states, when I say they don't allow, as you see in the deck here, post-award negotiation, what we're talking about is once you sign a contract in Illinois or any of the 5 states we will be talking about today, we have seen that none of the states currently allow a process for you to renegotiate a contract after it has been executed. So we're not talking about the time when you win the award to between you sign the contract. We're talking about the time frame between when the contract is executed to any time after if you want to renegotiate. Based on our discussions with state officials and from public materials that we've researched, none of the states formally allow for a renegotiation process. So that's something I want to highlight. And I just want to highlight when I say no post-award negotiations, that's what I mean, that after contract execution, none of these states allow for you to renegotiate your contract. So let's jump into it. Tori, can you please put us on the next slide? Thank you. So really quickly, the states we'll be talking about are New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Why we're talking about these states is because, as most of you may already know, and if you don't know, these were the states that have dealt with offshore renewable projects. A lot of these requests to terminate or renegotiate a contract because of environmental factors or market factors changing significantly between the time period when the contract was signed and when the contract is ready for energization. We saw that a lot of the developers saw huge market changes, and those bid prices that they bid into at the beginning of their development cycle were no longer economic. Again, most of these states saw that happen more on the offshore side, which is why we're talking about it, as that's where we have lessons we could take from what they faced in the offshore world and see how we could potentially apply it to onshore renewables, which is a similar request we're seeing here in Illinois, but again, very different outcomes, very different structures, and very different procurements for offshore and onshore, but similar themes with similar requests and potentially to have similar reforms. So that's why we're talking about these states. If there are any other states that you all know or have faced where they were facing similar challenges in terms of requests for renegotiation of price due to changes in market factors, and if there are certain reforms that are present in those states, or if they are grappling with these challenges that are not listed on the screen today, please feel free to bring them forward. We would like to learn from as many states as we can who are potentially seeing similar challenges to us. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So the first state we'll be talking about is New York. As most of you know, during 2023, New York had multiple offshore wind contracts and land-based projects terminate contracts due to those challenges we just talked about, where by the time the project was ready for energization, the market factors had significantly changed and the price that they bid into or were awarded was no longer economic for their project. At that point, there was no option for the developers, similar to in Illinois, to renegotiate that price. So their option was to either terminate or build an uneconomic project, which is how New York saw a lot of these projects cancel those contracts. I think out of all the states we've researched, New York faced this in the most significant manner when we look at megawatts and number of projects concerned. New York is also the only state in this list, I believe, that has a mechanism for dealing with such challenges for land-based renewables. every other state that we've looked into, including the ones we'll be talking about today, only had requests for offshore projects to have some sort of mechanism to address this challenge. New York is the only state that saw challenges for their onshore projects as well. So a lot of lessons for us to potentially take away from there. If anyone's interested in researching, East New York was the petition filed in their docket that represented 86 land-based projects, and then Empire Beacon and Sunrise Wind were the four, between them were the 4 offshore projects that were represented that terminated contracts in 2023. New York faced something similar where their option was to either allow renegotiation or do rebidding of some sort, and then they went through certain reforms to see how they could address these challenges going forward. At the time when the petition was filed, the New York PSC denied that petition for seeking financial relief, and in response, we saw there was a 10-point action plan that the governor enacted, including to accelerate the rebidding process. One factor that I want to highlight is, I believe, and again, Bram and team can correct me if I'm wrong here, New York conducts procurements once a year, whereas Illinois conducts procurements twice a year. So that accelerated bidding process made a lot of sense for New York. I'm not really sure if that's something it would make sense if we were in that position to do in Illinois, given we have procurements happening every few months. Another part that I want to highlight, I believe, again, is the bidding process and the time frame between award or when the bidding process begins versus award versus execution can be a few months in New York, whereas I believe it takes a few weeks in Illinois. So those are the 2 facts I just want to highlight at upfront where we are different from how we conduct procurements in New York and Illinois. So going back to, sorry, can we go back to the same slide? Thank you. So going back to the 10-point action plan, one of the action plan that focused on the particular challenge was the action number 3, where the governor enacted a rebidding process where NYSERDA launched an accelerated procurement process for both onshore and offshore, aiming to backfill some of the contracted projects that were terminated. Similar to principles that we share, the process was guided by prioritizing competition, simplifying bid requirements, incorporating inflation indexing, applying critical labor protections, and collaborating with the industry to optimize the timing. And then obviously all this was coordinated with the ongoing transmission activities as well. So what we saw happen in New York was, you can see a little bit of that timeline down below in terms of when we saw projects starting to build versus terminate versus when inflation adjustment was introduced in New York. So in 2022, solicitation was first when we saw New York implement an inflation adjustment mechanism for both large-scale renewables, which is land-based, and for offshore wind. The key difference was that for large-scale renewables, the inflation mechanism was optional, which means that you could submit either a bid with the inflation mechanism, or you could submit or opt in to not go in for the inflation mechanism applied to your bid. Whereas for offshore wind, from what I understand, again, it is by default, your bid will be indexed to inflation. So one key highlight between land-based versus offshore. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is the formula that New York came up with for the inflation adjustment mechanism for land-based renewables. As you can see, it is a more generic formula as opposed to what we're going to see for offshore wind. Their inflation formula touches on the PPI for all commodities and the difference between the bid is submitted versus construction. And then the indexation for inflation is only applied to 75% of your bid price. So 25% stays static or will not be adjusted, and 75% is adjusted. So this is the formula that New York came up with for land-based renewables. And if we go to the next slide, you'd see some more nuances for offshore. So for the offshore wind, we can see that the inflation indexing is more specific. It's more based on the labor costs, steel costs, copper costs, fabrication costs. Also CPI, if you look at the current 2024 solicitation for offshore wind, And then there's different weightings for how each of these will be impacted in your bid price. So very nuanced formula for offshore wind, whereas a more generic formula for land-based renewables. Now, one thing that I want to highlight is none of the states considered a post-award or a renegotiation process. And when we talk to a lot of the state officials, in addition to the concerns about administrative challenges with running or even having a formal renegotiation process, in addition to that, one of the concerns that was highlighted was the difficulty in maintaining the integrity of the initial competitive process. That was one of the key reasons that we saw why a lot of the states chose not to have a formal renegotiation process. So, for example, if there is a renegotiation process, how do you make sure that a bidder who has taken into account, let's say, some future uncertainties that they possibly saw coming in the market, whereas other bidders did not, how do you make sure that that bidder is not penalized by allowing others to not have taken such factors into consideration? So those were the key themes in our discussions as to why a lot of the states, in addition to administrative challenges, the reason was because they could not figure out how to maintain the competitive integrity of the initial procurement while allowing a renegotiation process. So I will pause really quickly. We will look at all the other states and what they did, but I just want to highlight that a lot of the outcomes that we've seen so far for states that faced, whether land-based or for offshore, some of the challenges that we are hearing from our stakeholders, the outcome was to either have a rebidding process or an accelerated process, and then to have an inflation mechanism in place. The way the inflation mechanisms are applied are different for almost all states. Some are taking more things into consideration, some are taking less. And we will go into a deeper discussion on why that makes sense or why that made sense then, and what our stakeholders would rather see today. But I do want to pause if anyone has any questions on New York before we start going into the other states, which you're going to see pretty similar implementations or reforms. So any questions at this point? Just out of curiosity, have any of the developers that are on the call today participated in any of these 5 states procurements? If you don't mind sharing that, it would be helpful to see who has had experience on this, or I guess have dealt with this or knows about this.
Yeah, this is Billy with Emeren. We actually had projects in New York and went through the process with the rebidding for one of our solar projects.
Thank you. I might call you out later to see if you have any other feedback for us. But is there anyone else that might have experienced that on any of the northeastern states? I guess taking a step back, is this something that's new information for most people on the call, or were you all sort of aware of what was going on in the northeastern states and the reforms that were taking place? So is this something that folks are well aware of, or is this something you're just learning about today in terms of what happened with these northeastern states with their challenges about offshore and land-based projects? I guess Elizabeth from Clean Grid, are you still on?
Yeah, sorry, I was just about to chime in. I'm not sure I exactly have a response to your direct question, but I do think that this level of detail is really helpful in terms of what New York's approach is. I look forward to seeing what you learn from the other states. I'm curious what the response, if the states, or maybe somebody from NYSERDA is on who can answer, what the experience going forward has been after the 2022 solicitation, because it looks like you've got a couple of years of doing this, under their belt at this point. Has it been a successful model? And what has that been the feedback from the developers participating to the state itself?
Great question. Bram, if you're still on and hopefully able to answer, that would be really helpful.
Sure. We have come out on our land-based side of 2 solicitations with the inflation adjustment and 1 active solicitation. And for those 2 that have concluded, we have a mix of both inflation adjusted and non-inflation adjusted contracts that have been advanced depending on the the preference of the bidder. And now we will wait to adjust them when they go to construction. If these are all pre-COD and really pre-NTP adjustments that we're talking about here that we will make at the time that these projects start construction. So, but we have signed contracts that are moving forward. Offshore wind, same thing from that solicitation that we ran earlier this year. And so we just remain, closely monitoring these indices so that we can track what our exposure is and track how these projects will be adjusted in the future. In talking about these types of adjustments, one of the areas of feedback that we've heard often from multiple counterparties is that the time that the adjustment is effectuated prior to construction is very critical to get right, and something that NYSERDA is taking another look at as part of our program review process. So when you're all thinking about financing and financial close and proceeding to construction, we open any feedback there on what the most helpful milestone might be for these adjustments to kick in.
Thanks, Bram. And just so I understand, how does it work currently? At what point is the inflation adjustment applied?
Yes, so for offshore, or it's comparable for both, but it's essentially when major construction activities commence on site, or a final notice to proceed. So not necessarily clearing and grading, but when a site is fully mobilized, we then take the average of either the index we were just showing for land-based, which is just PPI index, or these 5 indices, the composite of those. We take the 3 months prior to that commencement of full construction and 3 months post commencement, and we take that average. So the actual adjustment occurs approximately, or will occur approximately 4 months after construction begins.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Any follow-up questions, Elizabeth, for NYSERDA?
No, I think that's helpful. Except my one follow-up question is whether, aside from the feedback you've gotten from companies about the importance of the timing of the adjustments, have you, what has been your sense of the response to sort of the procurement events themselves? Do you think that this is overall improving the process with procurements, making them easier to obtain, or increasing participation, or has there been some other outcome?
I'm not sure if it is caused a sea change, right? We're still seeing comparable amounts of bidders, and certainly many new projects after, or returning projects after that, event last winter that Chandrika was showing, when we had a lot of projects terminate. So I think it's just you know, opening up a preference to certain projects that might have that risk preference to have this adjustment included versus other projects that may be closer to construction that would prefer not to have this. This is a risk sharing approach, right? Wherein there's a potential that a contracted price could be reduced pending where these indices go. And so I'm not expecting, you know, to hear every developer's preference on this call on what makes the most sense to them, but it's just one of those things for the folks that do have an interest in this. We would like to get the amount of risk sharing right. So long-winded way of saying it's opening up a new opportunity for some bidders that are taking advantage of it.
Understood, thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Bram. Tori, can we go to the previous slide really quickly? So, Bram, I guess I had a question for the land-based, as New York is the only state that we've looked at that currently has an inflation adjustment for land-based projects. Have you heard feedback on the index, the inflation index that's used for land-based projects? Because I see that most states, including New York, have a very nuanced formula for offshore, whereas it's, I guess, more generic for land-based. So I'm just wondering if you've had feedback on that and what NYSERDA might be thinking about that.
Yeah, we've heard back on this as a result of several requests for information. So we've conducted and the comments submitted to our program review. And it is a mix of some folks that prefer a simpler index like this, some folks that prefer no index at all, and others that have requested a more bespoke technology specific index, similar to what we were just looking at for offshore wind, that looks at key, you know, CapEx components that may change of a solar or wind technology. And so that is something NYSERDA is considering making available in future procurements for, you know, just a composite index that more, you know, better aligns with the actual costs in the market.
Gotcha. And then, Bram, as you mentioned, this is partly risk sharing, as the index can make your bid price go up or down depending on the inflation environment we might be in. So it's an option or optionality that New York is offering currently. I did see that some of the other states have placed a cap in which they say that the bid price can move up to a certain percentage up or down. But after that, it will be capped. Does New York, I didn't see anything like that for New York. Is that something you've received feedback on or have considered? And if there's anything you can share about why or why not that might be the case for New York?
Yeah, so it is not capped in the sense that the portion that is subject to market changes, you know, can rise or fall to that level. So in this example that we're looking at right here, there's a quarter of this adjustment that remains static. So that's really the one buffer that is built in here, but otherwise, no, they're not capped. And maybe a good difference that I think you mentioned earlier, but yeah, offshore wind projects that, you know, we're looking at having, you know, at minimum 3 to 5 years from contract signing to construction start were required to enter into this, and that was not required for the land-based side and continues to be optional, because we see projects ranging from, you know, months away from construction to 3 to 5 years on the land-based side.
Thank you. Before we move to our next state, New Jersey, are there any questions about how New York is implementing it, or anything you see or have heard so far for New York? Okay, if not, let's move on to New Jersey. So I do want to highlight again, like I said, none of the states that we talked to have or are considering a post-contract execution negotiation in their procurement. When they face these challenges, they being the 5 states that we're talking about right now, similar to New York, applied an inflation adjustment mechanism and potentially due to the environment they were in, where there were multiple cancellations, there were either an option to rebid in a future procurement, or there was an sort of immediate rebidding process that was set up to tackle that at that time. So New Jersey, similar to New York, saw an inflation adjustment mechanism introduced in 2023, where again, similar to New York, the fixed bid price would increase or decrease up to the cap. So this was the cap I was referencing that a lot of the states have adopted, up to 15% based on the change in the macroeconomic environment and the commodity indices, using the formula we're about to see on the next page. If there would be an increase or decrease of greater than 15% and folks wanted to see some relief for that, the only current option is to terminate and rebid. So no adjustment outside of the 15% up or down for New Jersey. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as I mentioned, New York was the only state that we can see that has a formula for land-based. Most everyone else has adopted inflation adjustment for offshore wind, and every state did it slightly differently, where we can see for New York, the formula was quite nuanced with individual commodity indices, whereas for New Jersey, it is more the average of the price component and over the 12 months. And as you can see, they take that into their base price and how that will move up and down. Again, capped at 15%. And then if we can go to the next slide really quickly, Tori. So you can see the indices that they are choosing, which is labor and how they're weighted is labor, the fabrication, steel, and then fuel. So most states are using some sort of, I guess, nuanced indices, but also for offshore wind. We're not seeing that for land-based for a lot of states, and we can see how, obviously, as you all know, some of these indices play a really big part, or components play a really big part into the capital cost of certain projects, especially wind projects, which is why the formulas are that specific. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. We'll cover this quickly if there are not any burning questions respective to that state. And then when we end at the end of the 5 states, I think that would be a good time for us to talk about what people feel about the formulas, about the indices that are being chosen, and this approach in general. But if there are any questions as I'm going through these states that you want me to answer, please feel free to interrupt me and unmute yourself. Massachusetts, again, also no formal renegotiation process, but they saw similar challenges in 2023 where multiple offshore wind projects terminated. Most of these projects over most of the states we talk about, similar to Illinois, when you terminate a project, there are certain costs associated with it. So you can see, given the sheer volumes of projects, there were pretty high termination payments made in context with these terminations. And the reforms, again, only applicable to offshore wind from Massachusetts, was terminate, opportunity to rebid, and then rebid with an inflation adjustment mechanism, which was introduced in 2024 for Massachusetts. So again, similar to New York, but that one was for land-based. Massachusetts did an optional price where the bidders can offer an index bid price in addition to a fixed or a non-index bid price. So you have the option to choose, but you are required to provide a fixed bid price as well. The only option or the only change that is allowed in this process for Massachusetts is for that project price and no other contract term. It is a one-time adjustment, and Massachusetts does it slightly differently, where it occurs 1 year following the approval of the contract. So as opposed to, I guess, what we saw in New York, where it's more dependent on project construction, Massachusetts set that formula to be applied strictly 1 year following the approval of the contract date, as that would be the adjustment date. Similar to New Jersey, there is a cap of 15%, which means your bid price, if you choose to go for an index bid, can move up or down up to a maximum of 15%. Next slide, please. Again, similar to New York, the formula that Massachusetts used for their offshore wind projects or for the inflation adjustment for offshore wind projects, similar components, you can see that they factor in your CPI, steel, copper, fuel, labor, and fabrication in addition to the interest rates. Next slide, please. Connecticut also faced similar challenges. Now, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island chose to do a combined or a joint procurement in March of this year. So a lot of the information and processes you see will be very similar for these three states. Connecticut also saw an offshore wind project award terminated in 2023. Similar to the other 2 or 3 states, they chose to terminate the agreement with an opportunity to rebid, where they held a joint procurement between Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, introducing that indexing adjustment mechanism, where the bidder has the option to bid a fixed price or an index price, which is subject to a one-time adjustment on a specified adjustment date. If they propose an index price, then they have to propose one price that is not an index price. So similar to Massachusetts, like I said, these 3 states took a very collaborative approach. So you'll see very similar mechanisms applied, where again, there is a cap of 15% to move up or down depending on the changes in the environment. Can we go on the next slide, please? Pretty similar formula here to Massachusetts, where they're looking at CPI, steel, copper, fuel, labor, fabrication, and interest rates. Next slide, please. Rhode Island didn't officially see, I guess, a termination, but they only received 1 bid in their offshore process that Rhode Island Energy decided not to proceed with, which was received in 2023, and applied these reforms in collaboration with Connecticut and Massachusetts in the joint procurement they held in March of this year, where, similar to others, the bidder must submit a fixed price with an option to submit an index price. And the date is slightly different, where they allow for the price to increase or decrease until project's financial close date. So we're seeing slightly different approaches between the states in terms of when this gets applied. Rhode Island did choose to go 1% higher than the other states, where the maximum adjustment is 16% up or down to be the final price at construction. If you do choose to submit what they call non-conforming price, which is an index price indexed to inflation, you are required to submit a conforming price, which is basically a fixed price, similar to the other 3 states we looked at that have applied this reform. Can we go to the next slide, please? The mechanism for Rhode Island is a little bit simpler, where they just take the minimum of the financial close and the PPA, and they apply the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI, and there's some particulars into how or what that particular statistic is and how it's applied. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so that was in a snapshot what a lot of these states did. I do want to get into any questions or comments you might have for what the other states did before we jump into how we feel about this reform strategy in general, and start talking about some of these inflation indices. So any quick questions or comments about how the other states handled these challenges?
With all of those other states, were those automatically included in the contracts, or were those optional, similar to the land-based resources in New York?
Yes, optional. So for all the other states, it is optional based on what I understand. And it is optional for land-based, like you said correctly, for New York, but not for offshore wind. But all other states, it's optional to choose inflation indexing. Any other questions?
I guess maybe just, and this is maybe a bit broad, but it's helpful to see all the different reference points. It seems like there's a lot of precedent for not negotiating post-award, but I mean, how much pain is there for bidders in these programs versus what's the structure of the process, right now, like in the fall with the IPA, on if you're awarded and, you're doing everything you can to make it work, but you just can't sign the contract because you're going to lose money and it's not, viable for your business. I mean, how much pain is there for bidders with the IPA process? Are they losing deposits, or what are the outcomes of being awarded and not being able to sign versus how is it working in these other states?
I think, and I'll pull in Ben to clarify, but from what I'm hearing, I think you might be misunderstanding two things. What we're talking about is once you've signed the contract, once you've executed the contract, you've been awarded and you've executed. Currently, if between the time period when you executed the contract to when your project is starting construction, if there's significant economic changes which change the bid price that you were awarded or that you contracted at, there is no mechanism to renegotiate. As far as between that time period of when you're awarded to between when you execute, that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about all these states when projects have been awarded, were executed, and then between the time period as they're building, again, more for wind than for solar since construction tends to be longer, there were requests to renegotiate the price at that point. So post execution. Ben, do you know what happens right now between award and execution?
I think you covered it really well, Chandrika. I think in general, most of the states, as Dom probably will know, is that after a selection of a winner, there is somewhat of a lengthy negotiation process. In Illinois, there isn't such a lengthy negotiation process by design. It's to give suppliers certainty very quickly that if you're selected as a winner and it is approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission, you will have a contract signed and executed within no more than 2 weeks from the approval date. So about 10 days from or so from bid submission, you should get a contract executed. So what I think this workshop is about, as Chandrika has mentioned a couple of times now, is really adjustments after contract execution. And to your question, Dom, I think if you can rephrase it and ask again, but I think what I'm understanding is how much pain is it to renegotiate and to versus just to resubmit a bid. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, this is helpful again. And I was asking about from being awarded on a bid to the time that you execute a contract. I understand that the target may be a couple of weeks, but if something shakes out during that period where you're awarded, but it doesn't work out to execute the contract because market conditions have changed, are there penalties imposed on bidders right now during that period prior to signing?
Sure, yeah. So it's a very standard process we have in most procurements that occur, which is that you put up pre-bid security. And if you bid and you do not sign the contract within, 10 days or so after the bid date, then you will lose your pre-bid security.
Right. Okay. And understand that you're looking to keep that a very tight window. So the assumption is if you're awarded, you're moving right to signing and getting that done.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
And Ben, if you don't mind, can you highlight what that pre-bid security, just so people have an idea of what numbers are we talking? Do you have a very high estimate for us? Is that something we can share?
Yeah, we can share that, but I probably have to we can put the, I think it's easier if we just put the link in the chat.
Perfect. That sounds great. Because you're right, that changes per procurement. So Dom, if you're curious what that security amount is between, let's say you bid and you were chosen to be awarded, because those are two different things. And then at that point, if you're chosen to be awarded or were awarded the contract and you choose not to execute, the amount you lose is that pre-bid security, which varies per procurement. And yes, Ben, if you can drop the link in the chat, you can look at where that stands for upcoming procurement.
Right. Understood and appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course. Great question though, because it helps us clarify which negotiation we're talking about and what time frame. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions for our current states? If not, are there any other states that we should have looked at that you might know that we didn't look at besides the 5 we talked about today? Okay. Hearing none, I think I mentioned this at the beginning that the way Illinois conducts procurements is obviously different from how a lot of these northeastern states we looked at. In terms of our procurements are more often, they happen twice a year, and they are a lot faster. So based on what I have heard and seen, I don't think that we are in a state where rebidding makes a lot of sense. Most likely the outcome that we've seen some of these states take was slightly different. And I think for Illinois, most people, if for any reason, aren't able to either win or secure a contract in the first procurement that year, typically just bid into the second procurement. So I don't particularly want to go a lot deeper into rebidding models just because I don't think that applies to us. But if anyone else feels differently, please let's hear it. Okay. As we saw for some of the states and from what we understand, the way that the states handle rebidding or entering into future procurements when such factors have shifted is to potentially to make it go faster, they raised maturity requirements for these projects. And I think that's what New York did as well in order to fast track these applications. I am curious for folks that have participated in our procurements, is this something, what do we feel about this? Is this something folks like, or is this something you don't necessarily like, having advanced maturity requirements in order to participate? As that was one of the strategies that New York pulled.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I mentioned I participated in the NYSERDA process previously, but yeah, I think just overall stepping back that the whole rebidding process, I think was just, at least in New York, was, beneficial to both the developers, but also, NYSERDA and the ratepayers, because you're basically resetting or rebidding, these projects against the current market rates and against other projects. So I think, yeah, overall, it's something I know we would be okay with. I know there's a little bit, like you mentioned, it works a little bit differently with more frequent procurements. And then I know one of the big questions with the NYSERDA process was the contract security. A lot of projects had contract security out there. Some projects hadn't signed their contracts yet, so there was a little bit of a gray area with being able to kind of retain that or roll it over into the next solicitation. But yeah, that was just my 2 cents on overall rebidding. And then, sorry, I got off track a little bit, but what was your original question?
Oh, just, I guess I was curious in terms of the advance. So we saw that New York pulled in some advanced maturity requirements for projects in order to be fast tracked. Is that something you thought affected you, didn't affect you, you all liked or didn't like? Why or why?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, from a very basic view, I mean, the more mature projects are going to have the closest outlook on pricing, which will have the least amount of risk in terms of, changes that we'll see in pricing. So obviously, it was a certain scenario. They were able to kind of pick a threshold with the interconnection queue with New York ISO specifically. I know that was a big point. You kind of had to have one of your agreements in hand, and which was obviously limits the playing field, but I think it makes it a lot less risky in terms of that group of projects, because like I said, they're going to have a much more accurate outlook on what they're seeing from interconnection pricing, and they're also going to be closer to procurement. And on the other hand, bidding a couple years ago, you're kind of just making estimates, and like we've seen in Illinois and in New York, and I mean across the entire industry and other industries, I mean things just have changed in the last couple of years, and it was kind of impossible to forecast that. So yeah, I think we're generally open to that. It's just it's figuring out exactly what those mechanisms are and what those thresholds are, I think, is the main question. I know we worked a lot with NYSERDA to kind of figure out what makes the most sense, and what was the most fair, and while keeping their kind of competitive procurement process.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. That's invaluable to us. So I am interested in hearing from the larger group, taking a step back, looking at what the other states did. What I'm hearing right now is having some sort of, from Billy, we just heard, from having some sort of ability to capture this market shift through inflation adjustment, I guess overall was seen positively, and I want to see if that's something our audience today feels as well. And then secondly, if let's say Illinois was to explore some sort of inflation adjustment, would that solve some of the challenges that we're talking about? Why we're exploring this post-award process, because that seemed to be the approach that a lot of the other states adopted. And as I mentioned, the renegotiation piece was primarily not adopted given the concerns on the ability to maintain competitive integrity of the procurement in the first place. And applying kind of this accelerated timeline along with inflation adjustment was seen a good equivalent to that. Is this how this audience is feeling, or how are you all feeling having learned about this? If Illinois were to explore something like this, would this address the challenges that we've heard so far on the market environment? And if there's any wind developers on the call, I would really appreciate your feedback, as we've seen, calling you out, as we've seen some of those concerns come more from wind, given how much longer it takes to build a wind project as opposed to a utility scale solar project. So if you're willing to share your feedback on inflation adjustment versus renegotiation, I would be all ears. I know there were a few folks, I don't know if they're still on, from the wind side of things. Even if not, if you're a solar developer and if you have any feedback for us on how you feel about the implementations that these states followed, please let us know. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you have any feedback from your members, in case folks don't feel like watching this individually.
I don't know that I have a good sense of the answer to that question for our members yet. But it did make me wonder about the possibility for renegotiation of other contract terms, and whether other states have run into any complications with things like specific, or with delivery of RECs as a part of the contract, or other terms that that might be presenting challenges?
So I think from what I understand, and thank you for bringing this up, some of the other terms that are in a part of our contract is something that's typically not something that significantly changes, like we talked about last time, between contract execution and construction start, which is what we were trying to focus for the post-award negotiation workshop process. But I do want to highlight we are open to all other feedback on other contract terms, which is partly why we touched on our RPS budget, how it works, and concerns with shortfalls and everything else under the sun around this procurement process. So I will say, I think as far as other contract terms are concerned, it is something that maybe would be more helpful if we were to explore through our long-term plan as it changes. It's a significant shift from how our contract currently is structured, where last time when we talked about this in the second workshop, I understand that what a lot of folks prefer is maybe a more generation-based rec delivery outcome, as opposed to a very strict rec delivery outcome, which is what we have right now, as that's the mechanism we use to meet our RPS goals. We don't, unlike some of the other states, we don't have a generation-based rec formula right now. So while I'm completely open to those feedback and those contract terms, I don't think that's necessarily something that significantly shifts between execution and construction. So I'm not sure if that's something is ripe for renegotiation, but as far as we explore improving our index rec process, I think that's very valuable feedback and something for us to consider in terms of changing the structure of the procurement. But like I said, I don't think that's something I personally see as a renegotiation piece. It's more something upfront whether you're okay with or not. So correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not understanding that correctly, and if you think if a more structural shift in our procurement, it sounds like, is what's expected or needed from what I'm hearing on that regard, as opposed to just renegotiating how many recs you could deliver down the line. If we were to change the structure, that probably sounds more like a challenge than down the line issue.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the specific proposed solution should be for it yet. But I think, yeah, I think in terms of adjusting strike price, it seems like, well, I don't want to speak out of turn. I don't want to speak out of turn there. So I'll just leave my question at that.
Sure. And that's fine. I think as far as we're touching on some of the other contract terms that are challenging, I think a great place is for us to discuss in workshops like these and for you to bring them forward during our long-term plan feedback process that will be out early next year. I think I do want to pull in Ben really quickly, because I think we did see some of that feedback filter into our feedback process for index rec procurement process that we typically, like I said, conduct twice a year, every year. And we did see some of the discussions from this workshop potentially making their way into that common process. And we are actively addressing that to make that less of a challenge and trying to solve that for our stakeholders here. So Ben, if you want to touch really quickly on the couple comments that we saw, especially I know Elizabeth pulled out the rec shortfall clause. So if you just want to touch on that really quickly on what we're doing to allow for some of the flexibilities that we noticed were requested in the last workshop, I think that would be helpful here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chandrika, and thanks, Elizabeth, for your question. So there are two significant changes that we have made in the last round of index rec contract adjustments or enhancements. The first is that we have moved to provide more give or leeway in terms of the shortfall before a termination event will occur. So prior to this round, it's an event of default if you miss your delivery year requirement 5 times, and on top of that, the amount of shortfall exceeds 1 year's worth of annual quantity. We have since moved that to 2 years worth of annual quantity. That's the first enhancement that we have made, double the amount of give in terms of the shortfall requirement. The second thing that we have done is that if there are structural shifts that has occurred that made it difficult for you to hit the delivery year requirement, there is now a last resort waiver process where you could bring this up to the IPA if, for example, the amount of shortfall does exceed 2 times the annual quantity, and on top of that, you have missed that 5 times. And because of whatever the reason may be, for good cause, out of your control, you believe that is warrant an appeal to the IPA, you can bring that up, and on a case-by-case basis, the IPA has the ability to now look into this and grant a waiver of those shortfall amounts. So that has actually been instituted in the final contract for this round of procurement. So you should take a look at that, and those adjustments were made pursuant to some of the comments that we have received from stakeholders like yourself. So we do appreciate those input, and we are, as you can see, over the years been very open. The posture has been very open to try to progress things in a very productive and constructive way. So we welcome those, and we do consider them very seriously when we do receive. Not sure if that answers your question, Elizabeth, but if you do have additional things you have in mind specifically, please do let us know.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful.
Thank you. So we only have 5 more minutes, so I do want to touch really quickly, and maybe this is something we can continue the discussion in the following workshop in terms of, especially if this was new information to folks on the call about how the other states are looking at inflation adjustment and what formulas they're using. If you have feedback on certain indices that you think represents land-based renewables, specifically in Illinois, better, or if there are ideas from what the other states have implemented that you think work really well, and I'll pull Billy really quickly on how potentially you all saw the inflation adjustment formula, on if there's any feedback on that particular index that's either used by New York or some of these others. I think that's the next step that we want to explore in terms of whether that mechanism is something that folks thought was helpful. We can, if that's something we can look at implementing in Illinois, and if that's something that would potentially solve the challenge that we were trying to address through a case-by-case renegotiation process. So if there's any parting comments on that, I would be very interested, especially Billy, I know you guys participated in the New York procurement. So any thoughts on the inflation formula that New York is using really quickly? I hope we still have it with us, I'm not sure.
Sorry, what was the question? That was for New York?
The question was just how folks feel about the inflation adjustment formula that states like New York are using for those that have participated in your procurement.
Yeah, I think generally working for the folks that are interested in it, with some key areas of improvement, including making them more technology specific and revisiting the actual adjustment date. But I think the data and the mechanics are well understood by the bidders themselves and folks helping to finance these projects.
Awesome, thank you, Bram. Anyone else that might have feedback on the inflation adjustment formula? If not, this is potentially something I'm hoping we can explore further in our next workshop. Okay, so in terms of next on the agenda, Tori, if you don't mind pulling that really quickly. I think we had a good discussion today, and I think we'll be exploring some of the topics from today's discussion in our next workshop, which will be focused more on what can be applied in Illinois, given the structure we work within. Hopefully taking a deeper dive into inflation indexing in lieu of renegotiation, indices that other states are using, and if that's something that captures the market for stakeholders, or if we should be looking at something else, if we should be looking at how the people feel about capping these index adjustments. And then we'll be talking about how we can apply some of this to Illinois. Our next workshop will be October 21st. So in about 3 weeks, Monday, October 21st, where we will capture what we've talked about in the first 3 workshops, what we think makes sense and can be applied in Illinois logistically is possible, and then take a deeper dive into inflation indexing in lieu of renegotiation. So thank you so much. I know there were some questions submitted in advance of the workshop by Clean Grid Alliance. We will submit written responses to those, Elizabeth, within the next week or 2 to be posted on our website.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you again for a really good discussion. I really appreciate everyone's time. And if we can be prepared to potentially dive deeper into inflation indexing formulas in the next workshop, I would really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, and see you on October 21st. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Andrew.